Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
So good, so good, so good.
New fall arrivals are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Get ready to save big with up to 60% off Vince, Kurt Geiger London, and more.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Because there's always something new.
Join the Nordy Club at Nordstrom Rack to unlock exclusive discounts on your favorite brands. Shop new arrivals first and more. Plus, get an extra 5% off every Rack purchase with a Nordstrom credit card. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Arts and Crafts of Old Japan, written by Steward Dick and first published in 1906. This story takes us into the heart of traditional Japanese artistry, as seen through the eyes of the author. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons on Patreon, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the podcast or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. As I mentioned, my goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible. That is why you'll hear a quick ad at the beginning of each episode. It helps generate financial support for the creation of the podcast. If you find this podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. You can also become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This helps create an ad-free listening experience, and you can do that simply by clicking on the link in the show notes. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would like to say hello to me, you can do that by visiting boytosleep.com. If you know someone out there who also needs a good night's rest, you can always share this podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Arts and Crafts of Old Japan by Steward Dick. Preface. This little book is intended not for the collector or the connoisseur, but merely for those who require an introduction to a field of art hitherto little explored, but which will well repay further study. For fuller information on the subject, many sources are available, but a word of caution is necessary. A bibliography of works on Japanese art would be misleading rather than useful, for much of what has been written regarding it is, as criticism, quite valueless. On Japanese painting, the most important, indeed the only sound work, is contained on a series of articles contributed by Mr. Arthur Morrison to the Monthly Review, 1902 to 1903. The writings of Mr. E. F. Strange deal fully and adequately with colour printing. Captain Brinkley is a good authority on ceramics, and Mr. Josiah Conda on landscape gardening and flower arrangement. The Transactions of the Japan Society contain many interesting and well-illustrated articles on Japanese minor arts, and the charm of Japanese life is nowhere reflected more pleasantly than in the writings of Sir Edward Arnold and Mr. Lafcadio Hearn. To the custodians of public and the owners of private collections, I am indebted for many courtesies, and especially to Mr. M. Tompkinson, Franch Hall, Kidderminster, for permission to reproduce several of the illustrations in the sumptuous catalogue of his collection. S.D. October 1904. Chapter 1. Introductory. In coming to the study of Japanese art, we must remember that we are entering a strange world, where life and language and even modes of thought run on other lines than ours. When Japan, only 50 years ago, was thrown open to the Western nations, in our ignorance and folly, we were at first inclined to treat the Japanese as a barbaric people, but never was there a greater mistake. For the truth is that their civilization is not only older than ours, but in some respects has advanced much further than we have ever attained. In an aesthetic sense, the people of Japan are cultured to a degree far beyond our Western standards. Their arts are full of beauties which are too subtle, too refined for our comprehension. Here, in the most civilized of all Western nations, one is dubbed a visionary and a dreamer if he hopes to see the day when the pleasures of art shall be the solace of the poor as well as the luxury of the rich. But this happy state has existed in Japan for ages. One of the chief characteristics of the people is their love for beauty both in nature and art. On the public highways are notices indicating to the wayfarer the points from which the most beautiful prospects may be obtained. The artisan mother in the city carries her babe out into the public parks at the festival of the cherry blossom, that its infant mind may be permeated by the beauty and fragrance of the flowers. And loving beauty, they can also express it, for to learn to write in Japanese is in itself a course of training in drawing. In art, the European requires that everything should be stated with the utmost fullness of a tedious realism before he can grasp its meaning. But to the more cultured Japanese, a mere hint or slight suggestion is sufficient. The leading characteristic of Japanese art is perhaps that it leaves so much unsaid, for the Philistine, who bulks so largely in the West, and has to be considered and propitiated at every turn, seems to be quite unknown in Japan. What wonder, then, that, with such a public, their art should be somewhat above our heads. Doubtless the canons of European art differ widely from those of the Far East, but these things are not essentials. All art is based on convention, in the terms of which its meaning is expressed. If we would understand Japanese art, we must accept its conventions. We must learn the language of their art and see things with their eyes. It is the fault of too many critics of Japanese art that they fail to approach it in this sympathetic attitude, and by such it is quite misunderstood. The mystic and beautiful Buddhist figures are tried by rules of anatomy, and the dreamlike Chinese landscapes by the laws of perspective. The materialist weighs the spiritual in the balance and finds it wanting. But we seem to be improving in these matters. Perhaps we are becoming more humble. Of late years, some of our leading artists are beginning to acquire the qualities which Japanese art has shown so long. Who shall say that the work of such an one as Whistler, in its sensitive feeling for balance, in its grace of line, in the unerring instinct which marks its spacing, and in the delicate harmony of its colour, is not essentially Japanese in style? Whether these qualities were knowingly borrowed from the Japanese, or whether the artist evolved them from his own inner consciousness, matters little. The important fact is that the qualities which mark the work of one of the greatest of our modern painters, and distinguish it from that of the vast body of his contemporaries, are just the qualities which for centuries have marked the art of Japan. But we know that Whistler was an enthusiastic admirer of Japanese art, and doubtless he would have been the first to acknowledge his debt. With the younger school, Japanese influence has been all-powerful. One might safely say that, but for the Japanese colour print, there would have been no modern poster school, working so daringly in bold outline and broad, flat tints, and recent black and white work is equally indebted to the Japanese woodcuts, with their beautiful flowing line and dexterous use of solid masses of black. The difference of mental attitude is not the only reason for the wide divergence in methods and ideals of Japanese art from that to which we are accustomed. There are other physical and material causes of great importance which have helped to decide its course. The basis of all pictorial and applied art is architectural, and here we find one starting point of difference between the styles of the East and the West. The frequency of earthquakes in Japan has rendered impossible the erection of buildings of the stately proportions and massive grandeur of other climes. The old Buddhist temples, which are the chief buildings, cannot vie in importance with those of India or China. In the Japanese house, the walls are but paper screens, the whole weight of the roof being supported by the four corner posts which, in their turn, are not sunk in the ground but stand on four large stones. This lightness of construction has to a great extent dictated the course taken by the arts of Japan. The Japanese picture, instead of being enclosed in a massive frame, is placed on a light mount of silk brocade, and when not in use is rolled up as we roll a map. And the field of applied art is similarly restricted. the temples contain most of the larger and more important works. There is no place for such in the house. The household furniture is reduced to a minimum. A few mats to sit on, for the Japanese use no chairs. One or two paper screens dividing the house into separate chambers at will. A charcoal brazier. A few cooking utensils and articles of pottery. Some liqueured vessels, fans, mirrors, and other ornaments. Articles of dress, weapons, and a few personal belongings form the whole field which is open to the craftsman. So in Japan, we have no rooms crowded with a profusion of heavy ornament. Reticence is the keynote, but what ornament there is must be of exquisite quality. Before dealing in detail with the different branches of Japanese art, it will be well to glance for a little at the history of the nation, in the light of which knowledge we shall better understand the social system under which these arts arose and the mental qualities which they embody. The civilization of Japan was the slow growth of many centuries. For more than 2,000 years, if we may believe the ancient records, the Mikado and his forefathers have been absolute rulers of Japan, the present dynasty stretching back in unbroken line to the Emperor Jimmu, who flourished about 600 BC. But as written history did not exist till some centuries after the beginning of the Christian era, the records of those early days are of a more or less legendary character, as one might surmise from the fact that the Emperor Jimmu was reported to be the grandson of the sun goddess herself. The origin of the Japanese race is shrouded in mystery. Little is known of them except that, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, they invaded Japan and drove out the Ainos, who still survive in the island of Yezo. A Mongolian race, no one can say positively whether the invaders came from China or Korea, from the Malay Peninsula or Siam, or whether indeed they were an offshoot from the wild Huns against whom China raised the Great Wall. One thing tending to show that they were not a branch of the Chinese race is that, even at that early date, China was the abode of an advanced civilization, while the Japanese were certainly little removed from barbarism, and indeed hardly more civilized than the Ainos, whom they displaced. But the Japanese character has always been receptive, and just as their new civilization is borrowed from Europe, so for the foundations of the old they are indebted to China. When they first came into contact with the influences from the mainland, it is hard to tell. It is said that the use of Chinese characters was introduced as early as 157 BC, and the early records give a full account of an invasion of Korea by the Empress Jingo about 200 AD. After the victorious expedition, many captives are said to have been brought back, who laid the foundations of Chinese learning and culture. The real civilizing of Japan, however, began with the coming of the Buddhist priests from Korea in the middle of the 6th century. Buddhism became the chief religion of the country, largely absorbing, though it was never quite superseded, the collection of myths and superstitions known as Shintoism. For Shintoism was hardly a religion in the usual sense of the term. As a Japanese writer admits, it had no moral code, but he adds naively, morals were invented by the Chinese because they were immoral people, whereas in Japan there was no necessity for a system of morals, as everyone acted rightly if he only consulted his own heart. The chief centers of the new culture, which spread over the land, were the great Buddhist monasteries. Just as our own medieval cathedrals and monasteries were the nurseries of the arts, so in Japan arose a race of artist priests. Their work at first applied solely to religious purposes, but afterwards widened out till, along with the sacred, there existed also a secular school. For 200 or 400 years, under these benign and mellowing influences, the country grew and prospered. The quiet and peaceful times from the 8th to the 10th century especially marked a period of great literary activity. Several of the most famous poets of Japan, whose writings still live in old tradition, flourishing during this period. As time went on, however, the horizon became overcast, and from the 12th to the end of the 16th centuries, Japanese history is one long record of strife and civil war. The Mikado became more and more only the nominal ruler. The real power lay in the hands of the warrior nobles. In the 12th century arose the terrible struggle between the two rivals, the Taira and the Minamoto families, each supporting its own candidate for the throne. A war which gave to legend and story one of its chief heroes, Yoshitsune, the Bayard of Japan. 100 years later, Japan, for the only time in her history, had to repel a foreign invader, a huge Tartar armada threatening her shores. But, as in the case of England, the elements fought for the islanders. A terrific storm played havoc with the Tartar fleet, and all of the invading forces, it is said that only 3 men escaped alive, and were sent home to tell the tale. Then in the 14th century, the bitter wars of the Ashikaga period once more bathed the country in blood. Those long years of war set their stamp on the nation, hardened its fibre, and brought out its sterner virtues. A military class, the samurai, arose, and these trained warriors were maintained by the local daimyos, or princes to whom they owed feudal obedience. Bushido, the way of the warrior, a stern but lofty creed of valour and devotion to duty, became the real moral code of the nation. For the annals of Japanese knighthood are full of tales of dauntless heroism, tales still told in every cottage in Japan, and retold 100 times in Japanese art. In those warlike days, there was little place for the gentler arts of peace, but the Buddhist temples still stood, quiet sanctuaries where, undisturbed by the turmoil and strife around them, the gentle, priestly philosophers pursued the even tenor of their way, and kept the lamp of art burning bright and clear. In the outer world, the military arts alone flourished, and the sword-maker was the king of craftsmen. In the 15th century, however, during a period of peace, a second wave of Chinese influence gave a new impetus to art. The court of the retired shogun Yoshimasa was a circle of artists and learned men. Culture once more reached a high level, and one of the most brilliant periods of Japanese art began. The 16th century saw a gradual consolidation of the empire. The Mikado for long had been little more than the nominal ruler, the chief power lying in the hands of the shogun, who controlled the whole executive of the state. But the local daimyos gave little more than a mere formal submission to the central authority. Each was practically absolute king in his own province. In 1603, Ieyasu, the first of the Tokugawa shoguns, for in his family the office became hereditary, came into power. A man of great ability, he set himself to complete the work of subjugation which his predecessors Nobunaga and Hideyoshi had begun, and finally reduced the turbulent nobles to the state of vassals, owing feudal obedience to the Mikado. Under his wise rule, the country settled down to a prolonged period of peace, unbroken for 250 years, in which art and industry developed greatly. The Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1867, especially in its earlier days, is preeminently the period of the minor arts, which then reached a perfection which has not been attained before or since. The force of the nation, formerly expended on war, was turned into these more peaceful channels. The daimyos of the various provinces carefully fostered the local arts, specimens of which were sent yearly to the shogun and the Mikado, and a keen rivalry existed between the different districts. Often the local lord would establish a kiln on his private estate, where articles of pottery and porcelain were manufactured solely for his own use. In the shelter of his castle, too, the artist in metal or in lacquer worked peacefully, freed from all sordid cares. Time was no object to him. The final result, everything. He had to consult no demands of popular taste. His work was always the best he could produce, and often years of labour went to the making of one perfect piece. As time went on, however, gradually the work lost its freshness and originality. It became richer and more elaborate, but tamer and less vigorous, and by the beginning of the 19th century, only echoed faintly its former glories, for the burden of feudalism was pressing on the country with more and more weight. The military classes, their employment gone, gradually sank into luxury and indolence. The only sign of life was the gradual rise of a more democratic feeling among the people. The latest schools of painting were more or less of the nature of a revolt from the traditions of the older styles, and the art of colour printing saw the rise of a school of democratic artists. The soil was already prepared. Some change was inevitable, and the change came when the country was thrown open to the nations of the West, feudalism finally abolished, and a democratic government established in its place. But contact with Western ideas and Western methods seemed to give the death blow to Japanese art. In painting, the European standards have played havoc with the charming and beautiful conventions of old Japan. Aniline dyes have spoilt the soft harmonies of the colour prints. In metal, in carving, and in lacquer, the new work is vastly inferior to the old. What the European market clamoured for was not quality, but cheapness, and so adaptive as ever, the Japanese turn out by the hundred superficial and mechanical imitations of the beautiful old work. Modern commercial methods have little to do with art, and in this case seemed at once to turn the artist into a trader. Japan is now a modern nation, Western in its civilization, in its methods, and seemingly in its ideals, destined to become a great industrial state. Perhaps, as she has done so often before, she may absorb the new influences and without loss of individuality follow out her own course. Perhaps, phoenix-like from the ashes of the old, new arts as brilliant may arise. But again, some say that the art belongs only to the more youthful stages of the world, and that in these days of science never again can the artist be more than a mere survival of an earlier age, one who still keeps green within him the youth which in others has long since withered and died. In a general survey of the arts of Japan, it will be best to begin with the art of painting. In a land of paradoxes, there is this paradox regarding Japanese art, that while their pictorial art is the most decorative of all pictorial arts, yet their decorative art is the most pictorial of all decorative arts. For the Japanese decorative artist rarely or never uses ornament merely as ornament. It almost invariably represents something more than mere beauty of line, mass, or colour. There is usually some pictorial motive attached. The lacquerer, for instance, rarely uses purely conventional forms, but flowers, birds, figures, even landscapes, make up his schemes of decoration. It follows, then, that the decorative arts of Japan are dominated by, and indeed are based upon, its pictorial art, and therefore the necessary preliminary to their consideration is a study of the art of painting. The European's introduction to the study of Japanese art is apt to be rather misleading, for in all probability the first specimens which come under his notice are the colour prints and paintings of the naturalistic and decorative schools of the last century. His first shock of surprise overcome, for both the medium and the style of presentment are new and strange, he speedily discovers in them real beauties. Harmonies of line and colour, finer and more subtle than any we have to show, arouse his enthusiasm, and he thinks that he has penetrated the mysteries of Japanese art, and that all its treasures lie before him. Even were it so, the boon would be no small one, but as a matter of fact, he merely stands upon the threshold. The real glories of Japanese painting are the works of hundreds of years ago. As well could one judge of the glories of English literature from the ephemeral periodicals of the day, as of the painting of old Japan from the products of the more materialistic schools of recent years. To know English literature, one must read the classics. To realize its full glory, we must go back to Spencer, Shakespeare, and Milton. And so with Japanese art, we must go back to the works of the old masters, to Cho Densu with his amazing power, to Sessui with his wonderful dream landscapes. Here we realize its grandeur. Then we feel that beautiful pieces of decoration, though the modern works are, here we breathe a purer and a finer air. We are in another world, a nobler and a greater one. The finest landscapes in the world are those painted by the old Chinese and Japanese artists. Monochromes, slight and shadowy as morning mist, but breathing the very poetry of nature. The art of painting was borrowed by Japan from China, the first teachers being the Buddhist priests who crossed over from Korea in the 6th century. This origin, and also the nature of the materials used in the art, stamped it at the outset with qualities which have ever since distinguished it. The ordinary instrument for writing in China and Japan was the brush, dipped in Indian ink, and to form the native characters was, in itself, an exercise in drawing. Calligraphy, indeed, as penmanship in the old days of medieval Europe, was reckoned as one of the fine arts, or rather, from the Chinese point of view, painting was reckoned one of the branches of calligraphy. This calligraphic basis is the root of most of the conventions of Chinese and Japanese painting, and in the quality of the brushwork are to be discovered many of its beauties. For by means of line alone, not a pen line thin and hard, but the supple swelling line of the brush, the artist not only renders the outlines and shapes of things, but suggests modelling, even the different planes of distance, in a manner indefinable in its subtlety. Colour, except in the later and more naturalistic schools, is used in flat tints only. This absence of chiaroscuro is often quoted as a defect of Japanese art, but if all that can be said has been expressed by line, why add light and shade? One has only to study the work of one of their masters in the use of the brush, such as one as Motonobu of the Kano school, to understand not only how unnecessary it would be, but how impossible. We would as soon wish to see filled in one of the exquisite outlines of Flaxman. It is like setting a beautiful poem to music. You may exchange one melody for another, but both cannot exist together. And we must remember that all use of line is a convention, for line does not exist in nature, and Japanese art, after all, only differs in this respect from European art in having used this convention with greater freedom and more consummate mastery. And that concludes tonight's reading. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.